Let's see, Kit, Julius. I know if I'm probably I absolutely know I'm dating myself when I reference Romper Room, but they used to have this right, magic mirror, and she used to say something about a little poem, and then she'd say, "I see Michael, I see Jimmy, I see Kara," and just throw out generic names. There are people there who appreciate it. All right, we're gonna just about get started. Let's give it another 30 seconds and then we get going. Okay, well, let's get this kicked off. Well, welcome everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening. Welcome to the second meeting of the HCDAgile for Data Special Interest Group. My name's Carol Riggy. I'm the Human-Centered Design Practice Lead at 1904 Labs in St. Louis, Missouri. A little bit of background on the right, you see the first meeting to address this topic specifically was held in St. Louis in October 2019, back in the good old days when we could actually be in the same room together. Those were fun days. And this virtual meeting continues the work from that initial session. Now, before we dive into the topic, just a little quick housekeeping. First, as we noted when we sent you the link, the session is going to be recorded, and we'll share that with you after the meeting if you have colleagues who are unable to attend, or if you want to review anything. We're going to use typical web meeting conventions that we're all getting really used to lately. Keep yourself please on mute until we call on you if you want to talk. Just by default, keep down the background noise, all that good stuff. Please use the chat window to do things like raise your hands, ask questions, make comments. We'll have Martha Valenta from 1904 monitoring the chat, and she's going to be reading the questions to us. We'll build in plenty of time for that. Please refrain from using the chat, if you will, for side discussion, so we can make sure that everybody's included as a group and that we don't multitask too much. If you have multiple monitors, you might want to go into speaker view in Zoom on the top right. That cuts down on where we're going to be doing a poll a little bit later on. Sometimes that confuses things. The poll shows up somewhere else. So, use the speaker view if you can. This is going to be less of a lecture and more of a discussion. We really want to hear from everybody about what you've done in this space, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what questions you may have. So please join in as much as we have time for. We will open this up to discussion. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to give a quick overview of the topic. Then we're going to go into a couple of case studies presented by Lisa Bruce from 1904 Labs. Very high level, just to kind of give us some context about this topic. It is kind of a vague topic if you don't define it well. So we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page before we have our guest discussion leader, Kate Walton from ExxonMobil, who will be sharing a case study from her experience and leading a discussion. Again, we want to hear from you today. And then we'll close. We'll be done by the top of the hour and talk about next steps. So why are we here today? Well, everybody's on the call today because we have an interest in this topic of how to apply human-centered design to data projects. And when we talk about data projects, we're talking about things like data pipelines, data lakes, APIs, CLIs, command line interfaces, decision science models. And HCD folks have traditionally referred to this kind of stuff as like either plumbing or, you know, the back end stuff, or stuff that happens so deep within the system, so far away from what we usually deal with as a user experience that we have in the past. we haven't really focused on this at all in some of our cases. We didn't engage. We didn't think we needed to be engaged. Stakeholders didn't think we needed to be engaged because in everybody's mind, HCD is all about screens and users, end users, and customers and that kind of stuff. But over time, we've come as an industry to understand that even if there's no screen, there's still humans. There's always humans who interact with a product or who are affected by the product. And these humans, in the case of data projects and products, might be developers or data scientists or any number of personas. So once we really wrapped our minds around, yeah, there's always humans involved, many of us human-centered designers have found ourselves having to engage our skills on projects such as these. So, you know, of course, in our due diligence, we go look for a book, or, you know, we go online and look for papers, or look for best practices. And if we tried to do that, we probably found out there's not a lot out there. So, you know, we did what we always do, right? We did our best. We kind of made it up as we went along. Maybe we reached out to colleagues, we tried some stuff, but boy, wouldn't it be great to have other people who are in the same boat that we could talk to? Well, today I want to welcome you to the boat. This is the boat now. Everybody who has an interest in this topic now, you know, we have a peer group that we want to engage and grow over time. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start with a couple of example case studies, as I mentioned, Lisa Bruce, and then Kate Walton will talk specifically about doing user experience on a data lake project. And then we really want to dive into a lot of discussion with you guys starring in that role. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this next topic here. Real quick though, I did, because we're using the term HCDAgile, I just wanted to give a quick definition, and then we're going to dive into our session. It's a whole nother discussion. It's a process discussion. HCDAgile is the term that we use in 1904 Labs to describe a hybrid approach that brings together the best of HCD and Agile. It's how we engage on our projects, including our data projects. So if you're interested in process, just reach out to me later. This is another discussion that I'm happy to have, and we probably will. So keep an eye out for that. Now, before we hand over the session to our guest discussion leader, Kate Walton, we're going to start with just a little context by way of two quick case studies. So now I'm going to hand over to Lisa Bruce from 1904 Labs. Lisa was one of the first here to really crack the code in terms of how to apply human-centered design to data projects. So she's going to share some of her experiences with you now. Go ahead, Lisa.
Thanks, Carol. So the first project I want to talk about has to do with a medical school research repository. And in this situation, a medical research institute, academic institution came to us. They said, we really need to ease the access of data for our users. We need to make their experience a little bit better, and we need to make our research data repository more extensible. Now, at the base of this, it was really, we want to be able to move data from lots of systems into this one system, and we want to follow protocols that will allow users across many institutions, not just ours, to use it. And as Carol mentioned earlier, this particular project had no user interface, and I thought, okay, how's this going to work? So where we started, we did extensive interviews and discovery to really understand. It was a small group of people that actually touched the system, but we spent a lot of time to develop personas and journey maps to really inform our work. There were a couple of, in a lot of the case, they kind of knew what they needed to do. X needs to move to Y. These are the kinds of things that need to happen. But there were areas where how that impacted the user was important. And so in those areas, we did story mapping to sort of gain some alignment, and also to kind of figure out, okay, what do we have to do and what would be ideal to do? And it really engaged them in that process. And then throughout the process, we kind of kept coming back to those key personas. And Carol, if you could move to the next slide. So what happened? Well, at the end of the project, we really made it significantly easier for users to access data in the repository. The data quality was also increased. We enabled collaboration across institutions with better access. We were able, and this is, I think, a key one, we were able to foster strong empathy among the client team. And when I say that, I mean among the folks that we were working with and with our own team. So there was a really good, solid understanding gained through all those discussions and that work together. And at the end of it, we created a sustainable system to support future growth, including integration of new data sources. That was a big part of this project. So what worked best? The interviews that led to the personas and the journey maps really allowed us to get to a lot of in-depth information. And I should stop and say, it wasn't just me as an HCD professional doing this. It was me with our team. So the technical folks who had the expertise and understanding to press a little harder, to go a little bit deeper, to sometimes frame some of that conversation were there. And we really worked in close partnership to move through this process. And that required me to be a little bit more willing to open up that process, right, and to engage. And I think it really allowed us then to end up with a better product. And I think the thing that worked the best was the interviewing and that work. The story mapping, which we had to adapt to a data project. I read the books, I looked at things and was like, this doesn't quite work the same. The system kind of sits above the user in many ways. So I think that we managed to walk through that pretty well. What was most challenging was finding the right approach, the balance between the technical and the human-centered needs. At what point do we need to use the tools in my toolkit, and at what point do I need to take a step back and really let the technical piece work itself out? So that was a really interesting process. And at the end, we had a client that was happy with what they got. We had users whose needs were met. We didn't get to do as much as we wanted, but I feel like we were able to really deliver something that had a human focus to it, and the users valued that. We can move to the next slide unless anybody has any questions. Okay. So second example, in this case, we had a digital agriculture company. They needed a way to enable the easy adoption and utilization of a platform that both their internal engineers and their external engineers used to access agricultural data. So that was the technical problem. The bigger picture was that it was a giant paradigm shift for developers and others at the company, because what they wanted to do was actually test their code in production. And that's where the human-centered design piece came in, because we went through extensive discovery. We did more than 30 interviews. We produced personas and journey maps around this as well. But what we discovered in that process was that the users had significant anxiety about this paradigm shift. So while it might not change the technology we develop, how we develop it, how we help them understand, and how we engage them was really critical. And that how we engage them came in when we did the story mapping. So we again had to do some adaptation. We experimented a little bit to be able to get some alignment and some shared vision on what we were doing. And if you go to the next slide, please. So the outcomes, we improved the developer productivity. We had a faster, easier system. We enhanced their self-service functionality. So the whole point of this was to make it so that developers could use a set of essentially DevOps tools to help them do their work. It increased their cross-team communication. And it also created some clarity of communication and processes around this new paradigm. So it helped them get more comfortable. What worked best? Again, involving the technical team in the research and the user experience evaluation. So not only did we do interviews, as we started to develop chunks and pieces of this, we actually went to the developers and we ran user experience evaluations with them to see, okay, is the way that we're creating this and implementing it working for them? And how do we adapt that? So what was most challenging, again, was that balance between developer and technical time. And also, everybody got really excited about solving the problems, but sometimes I had to grab the reins just a tiny bit and say, okay, let's not make a conclusion or an assumption before we kind of work through what we've learned. So that was that particular project. And I'm going to stop and say, are there any questions or any comments?
There's a question. Kit would like to know what kind of changes needed to be made to the story mapping or other exercises. Are there any examples?
Yeah, I think, so what we did is we actually did 2 or 3 practice runs with our team before we got with the client to explore how might we ask this question and what will allow us to elicit helpful information and won't anchor us, right? So honestly, what I would say is you have to practice your questions and try them out and see where they lead. Because the system is its own person in all of these situations, you have to figure out how to find the balance between the system as an entity, like a persona, and the people who act on that system, and then how you're going to frame your questions and move forward. So it's really important to, before you work with a client around this, or before you work with a broader team of stakeholders, take a few runs at how you're going to ask the question and how you're going to move down that path. You run the risk of anchoring, but that's really, so that's what I would say. We really looked at the pieces of work that needed to happen in that project, and then who the actors were on it. So I hope that was enough, but I'm also conscious of time, and I want to make sure that we keep moving forward. Did that answer your question?
We have a couple more minutes for questions for Lisa before we move on to Kate. So if anybody has additional questions, go ahead, Martha.
Not seeing any others right now. As soon as they pop up.
Okay. That was really pretty much from my standpoint, that was what I had around these case studies. I would say the big takeaways, though, are involving the technical team. I know there's this concern a lot of the time about using developer time, but it was a really good investment. And I think if you asked team members on either of those teams, it was a really good investment in time. And the side benefit that I don't have written down here, and I should have, is that it created the relationships among the developers, with the HCD team, with the client, with whoever needed to be engaged in this. These conversations allowed us to really build relationships that were fundamental to the trust and the working together moving forward.
So we have a question. Matthew would like to know, was a service design blueprint used to modify and better explain the journey map?
Not really. No, and I'm not sure I'm understanding totally how you're using that terminology. Can you give me just a little bit more explanation?
Yeah, Matt, go ahead and jump in there. You can unmute yourself.
All right, I was just curious. It just seems like all of this without an interface, it seems like a service design sort of strategy almost kind of plays into it. Some of the things you were talking about almost started to like sound like service design a little bit, because you don't have that interface. You just have what the people are doing within the process. So I didn't know if it's like connecting like all the systems per touch point would actually even more give a better detailed look and a more holistic look as to what the process is, so people could feel more, I think you said, comfortable and have a more shared vision of what was going on.
We did not go to that length in these two projects. There have been other projects at 1904 where I think folks have done some of that kind of work. I don't think that I can speak to that now, but it's a good approach. I think whatever it takes to help people understand the holistic environment that you're working in and what acts on those users, you know, what their experience is like. So if there are multiple systems, how those things interact, I think that's really valuable work to look at. And I think that is a human-centered design task. It just hasn't always been couched that way.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, Martha?
Nope, we're good.
All right, Lisa, thank you so much. And stick around because we're going to have a lot more Q&A near the end, and we'll give folks a chance to talk to anybody on the line. All right, so let us introduce our discussion leader for today, Kate Walton. And before I do, I'm going to actually ask you guys for a show of hands, physical or chat. How many of you have ever engaged in a project such as the ones that Lisa described? Just kind of give us a thumbs up or wave your hands. All right. How many are popping in there, Martha?
I'm not seeing folks use the raise hand. Oh, there's one. So yeah. Just to, so everyone knows, you can, there are, I think, reactions you can have.
There you go. Yeah, just wanted to get a general gauge of where folks are at on this topic. So when Kate starts talking, she can have that in mind. And speaking of Kate, I'd like to introduce her now. Kate has over 25 years of UX experience and is very passionate about delivering value through deep user understanding, so a real researcher at heart. Kate currently supports 3 amazing UX teams at ExxonMobil within what they call the upstream organization, and she'll explain more about that. Her first project at ExxonMobil was focused on data, and a great reason to have her joining us today. And the scope for her team has continued to grow. Kate also was the attendee at that first HCDAgile for Data Summit last October that I referenced earlier. And a little side note, I'm really proud to call Kate a colleague and friend for over 15 years. So thank you, Kate, for offering up your expertise today, and the meeting is yours.
Thank you, Carol. And 1904 Labs. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure I'm not talking on mute. Okay, good. Definitely happy to be here today, and most importantly, I'm looking forward to learning from you all. So to that end, I'm going to go ahead and jump into my discussion, because really that's just to kind of set up from what I would love to learn from the rest of you. Well, depending on the maturity of UX in your organization, we all know it can be tough sometimes to make a project team understand that we're not there just to design the presentation layer at the end, that really our most fundamental value comes far before we even get to that stage. So it gets even trickier, as Carol and Lisa were saying, when what you're working on has been traditionally perceived as a purely technical problem. So in our case, building the data lake. It was unknown territory for me and for the rest of my UX colleagues. It was quite a baptism at ExxonMobil, being my first project in data. And so since then, we've been basically just carving out our path as we went. What I'm hoping to do is I'd like to walk you through what our process ended up looking like. But ultimately, as I mentioned, I'm really hoping to hear from you all and learn from the rest of you, because I'm still very unsettled and still figuring this out. So I know I've got a lot to work on, and hope that and expect that this forum is going to really be able to create a great opportunity for us to optimize our approaches together. So, Carol, you can move to the next slide. So these are just the big major buckets, a very high level of what our yeah, that one, what our engagement was in our process. So I'm going to walk you through each of these, but first I'll tell you a little bit about the project. So as Carol mentioned, I work at ExxonMobil in the upstream portion of the business. And what that means is in upstream, we focus on finding the oil and getting it out of the ground, but it's a lot more complicated than just drilling a hole in the ground. What we do is we collect a lot of data and we use it to help us do that better. But we've got problems. We got data problems, or I should say data opportunities. And I know that they're not uncommon. I'm sure we're not as very special in that particular case. So some of our issues I think you will have heard before. We've got issues with data accessibility. We've got a lot of data silos. A lot of those silos are locked, so there's a lot of hoops that users have to jump through to get to the data. We've got data quality issues. We've got lack of data history and versioning and lineage information. We've got lack of data connectivity. So we have a lot of very intelligent end users who are spending a large amount of time pulling manually data sources together into spreadsheets, right? So, and that's not the end of it, of course, because as soon as they do that, what it does, it creates new static, isolated sources of data, right? So there's masses of data all just pocketed everywhere throughout the organization. So it just makes the problem worse. But those are some of the problems, I think, as well. We have to make sure we don't forget there's a lot of missed opportunities that come from insights and predictive power that when you build these new data connections that they can provide, so things like trends and patterns. So it's not just about making our lives easier, it's about really bringing more power to the table. So what did we do? We are working on building a data platform and that will be used by the engineers and the geoscientists in performing their jobs. And the goal is to bring together data by building relationships across currently unlinked sources. And sometimes we'll be using machine learning to do that. But an interesting aspect of our particular project is that the scope of our involvement on this project is only extending to building the actual data lake itself. The ownership of any front-end user interfaces that would ultimately serve up the data to the end users would belong to our internal customers, business teams. So in essence, they would come in, connect into our data platform with their tool of choice, whether that be a dashboard or an existing application or even building a new application. So we had no say or even necessary visibility on what front-end interfaces we're going to be tying into our data platform. So our UX team was brought in, and maybe, okay, to be honest, it was more, I should say, that we negotiated our way in. So, and without a clear understanding of how we should engage, you know, fake it till you make it. Even in the best cases, though, we know that sometimes, as I was saying earlier, UXers, we have the job of trying to help project teams understand that we can do a lot more than just make the front end look good and behave well. And in this project, it was particularly challenging for them to understand because we were not going to be designing or developing or maintaining the end user interfaces. So to be honest, I had to figure this out myself, you know, before I could even sell anybody else on it. Carol, I think we're already at the process slide. Yeah, okay, we're good. No, if you'll go back to the previous one. That's good, thanks. So let me walk you through what our process ended up being. As I was mentioning, these are just sort of the big buckets at a very high level. But the first is looking at identification of the problem. And I think UX typically has a very, I think, understandable role here. In our case, in some cases, it's UX who brings the issues to the table based on generative research that we've done. However, in a lot of cases, we have business teams that bring the problem to us to solve. They've been living with these problems for years. They're very well versed in the problem. They know what they need, right? So sometimes we can just take it directly from them and start to work out the details. But once we have an understanding of the problem domain, the next big area is building out the lean business case. And this turned out to be a game changer for us. So building a data lake is an enormous undertaking. We have a lot of data, and I'm sure everybody says they have a lot of data, but it's true. And we had to figure out as a project team how to phase it. I mean, how are we going to slice it up? And there's at least two ways, because we tried them both. And one way is that you basically take each source and you start basically pulling it into kind of an area where it's going to be centralized. But the other way, and where we ended up, the way that we ended up attacking it is in a use case approach. Which thankfully really helped our case with UX. So by the use case approach, forgive me if I'm over explaining, but what it meant is that we would have a use case that we were going to solve, and then we would pull in or connect up only the data that was relevant for that use case and pull it across the designated data sources. So we didn't attack it data source by data source. We took a slice across all of the data sources and just pulled in the data that we needed for that use case. And then you move to the next use case, and then the next use case, and then it gradually builds up the data platform in a kind of sequential way. The benefits, you're probably all familiar with some of the benefits of use case approach, but I'm just going to go through a couple here, is that number one, this allowed us to make sure that we were tying the work we were doing to the business and the user and goals. It also allowed us to define a value hypothesis, which allowed us to prioritize. It also allowed us to get to actual usage earlier so that we could test out our technical approach and the value hypothesis earlier so that we could make sure that we're on the right track and redirect if we needed to based on the feedback that we were getting. But I think, as I alluded to earlier, the key benefit for us as UX was that having that use case approach made it much clearer about how we could engage. It kind of outlined that for us, at least as a starting point, because in order to build a solid use case, you need to understand the users, their goals, workflows, benefits, etc. So this was a pivotal point for us and gave us a good anchor to get started.
Hey, Kate?
Yes.
We've got a question. And that is, how do you know you've accounted for enough use cases? And then we have a comment, which is heart, lean business case. Love using use cases to tie business goals and values. So the question though was, how do you know when you've accounted for enough use cases?
Do you, I can definitely answer that. I'm just hoping maybe we could hold the questions until the end, just to, if that's okay. Because yeah. That way I can kind of get through everything really quickly, and then we can tackle all that at the end, and we can flip back to the slides.
Feel free to put them in chat as they occur to you, and then Martha will manage that for us.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so anyway, so it was pivotal. This was how we made sure that, again, that we're checking to make sure that we're providing value as we went along, solving it in the right way, but also gave us kind of an entry point into that process. So what we ended up doing in this phase, how we tangibly interacted, is that we contributed to obviously defining the current state and the opportunity. We also contributed to the high-level solutioning. And what I mean by that is that when I, like what is the solution to the problem? Is it a new database? Is it just connecting data together across existing databases or sources? Is it even, maybe it's not that, maybe it's organizational change, or maybe it's a change in the user workflows or the data workflows. Or maybe it's as simple as just a new front end to an existing data source. So before you even start committing to like, oh, we've got to basically build a database, back up, look at the problem, and kind of figure out what is the best solution in a broader sense. And this is maybe kind of referencing that service design approach. We also helped to define the value statement based on our understanding of the user and the business, and worked the roadmap with the project stakeholders and helped define kind of the good starting point with the MVP, right? So anyway, the lean business case helped us kind of get anchored in, and then we got to the next part, which is what I call conceptual design, where we're taking sort of like this high level idea of what the solution is, and we're saying, okay, this is kind of what it looks like, but how do you do that when there's nothing that you can see? So this was our challenge. And so we wanted to look at fleshing out the requirements and creating that future vision. Our goal was to provide the development team, a form of user requirements and this vision, so that they would have an idea of where we're headed, and we're all aligned and kind of moving to the same, what I would call North Star. But the question was, what does that look like, right? So we're not going to do a bunch of detailed wireframes. And what's the best way to communicate that information in a way that our technical team was going to understand? So I am going to ask Carol to flip to the next slide, and I'm going to show you some examples of some artifacts that we created. I can't say that this is necessarily the right answer, but it was an answer. I'm looking for feedback from you guys, but this is quite scrubbed, so it won't have a lot of meaning for you, but I'll talk you through that. So when we looked at the problem domain to get started, and then we looked at the user's goals, what we started doing is defining the sub-questions that lead up to that user goal. So in order for the users to do their job, what questions do they need to have answered? And in order to answer those questions, what data do they need, right? And so what we ended up getting was a list of the data for that use case that would be required to answer those questions for them to be able to do what they needed to do. But we didn't just come up with a list of data. We also got the user's perspective on the best source, because very often data resides in more than one location, and users often had an opinion. We paid attention to their language. We listened to the labels that they use for the data. We asked questions like, for how fresh does the data need to be? Is it okay if you only need it once a week, or does it need to be second by second? And what do you mean by real time? Because people mean different things when they say real time. So moving to the next artifact on the right, we also generated kind of a data model. Now this is a data model from the user's perspective, and what the relationships of the data would need to be in order to serve their needs. So it doesn't reflect the actual or the technical approach. It's from the user's perspective. And we shouldn't, I just want to make a point, it may be obvious, but this is not the same thing as information architecture. So information architecture also demonstrates relationships, but I'd almost say that's almost sort of single dimensional because it's going to raise up to the interface. This is multidimensional, and this is looking at, there's multiple axes that can come off of this, right? So, but what this allowed us to do is convey to data scientists the user's perspective on the data relationships in a format that we felt like they would be able to understand. So they could kind of contrast it to what they were thinking to do themselves. And it just brings in kind of a new angle for them to compare against. And then Carol, if you'll go to the next slide. And then I've got what we call, well, what I call, I won't blame this on anybody else, but it's what I call data vignettes. It's sort of like little data snapshots of, in order to answer those questions, what would be an ideal data view? And what that's going to communicate is, like, for each one of these questions, like, what data needs to be displayed, but more importantly, what data needs to be displayed together in context of one another, which starts to implicate the data relationships. And then you start to be able to assess, okay, so what data relationships do we already have versus the ones that we need? And then for those that we need, how do we, what's the best way to build those? Do we do that relationally? Do we do that with machine learning? We can also, with this, start to imply how broad or granular the data needs to be. So do the users need to see it at the forest level, or do they need to see the trees, or both, right? And so we can start to kind of demonstrate in a more tangible way what those requirements would be. What you'll notice is that none of those are really specifying, or we're not trying to specify the user interface. It's agnostic of a platform. There's no other UI than, as I mentioned, the data that's needed, and maybe a suggestion, just a suggestion of controls that demonstrate when data manipulation may be required, because we have learned that sometimes that data manipulation requirement will have an impact on what is stored or connected and how that's done. So, but beyond that, we didn't do anything more, because you'll see we have no information architecture. We're not showing how things would be stitched together. We are presenting no navigation. We're not really prescribing any sort of interaction model. And we're just really kind of suggesting a data display enough to say this is kind of the data that's needed and what's got to be connected. We're not really saying that it's got to be a line chart or a bar chart. I think that would come later. So although I think our use case was, not use case, sorry, our case study is a little bit maybe special in that we were not going to be building out the user interface. I don't know that this is really specific or irrelevant for everyone else, because I think before development begins, because this is the stage before they've even actually started building anything, what this is doing is providing guidance to the development team about the direction to go before you have to really kind of get bogged down in the details of all those widgets and controls and process flows and information architecture, right? So this gives them enough guidance to know what they've got to hook up on the back end and what they've got to bring together. While you have time to work out the rest in parallel to development. All right, so Carol, if you'll go to the next slide. So going back to the process, so once we got through that, we then went to, we were in development and where we were providing support. And then this is, very similar to other projects where you're there to answer questions, do further investigation as needed for things that you just didn't predict that you were going to need to know. But I'll give it a specific example of something that we did that I think was, you'll probably run into, is that we provided a lot of support for the data mapping. Because we had a good understanding of what the data the user intended and what they called it, but that's not necessarily very easy to map to within the existing data sources because they don't necessarily call it the same thing. So sometimes you have to look at things and really kind of tease out, no, I think that's what they were talking about, right? There's things that kind of look the same, but they're not the same. And that's something we we couldn't have done on our own. We can only basically supplement and support the data scientists in their work for that. And then the final stage, which I think everyone is much more familiar with, is the UI design. We personally had minimal play here, other than we did do a little bit of front-end design, not really design, but just enough front-end implementation so that we could prove out the work that was being performed on the back end, a la Agile. But and of course, as I was mentioning, the development and that UI design can run concurrently. So that was our overall cycle. Carol, you can go to the next slide. The way I talked through it, though, it probably made it sound a lot simpler, easy, and maybe obvious than it was. It really wasn't. And I think there's still a lot, at least for me, to learn and figure out. If I had to recap our experience, I think this chart shows where I feel like we had an obvious fit and where we had to work a lot harder to demonstrate our value and kind of negotiate how that would work and look. So I think, you know, at the beginning stages in problem identification, I think very often project teams know to come to us to do, say, generative research to help them better understand the problems. At the end of the project life cycle, when it's time to design and implement the front end, they know to bring us in. It's that middle bit. I think lean business case was better, but as soon as we got into conceptual design and development for these type of projects, it was a little bit trickier to really kind of demonstrate our value and also be sure that we weren't getting in their way. So I have 3 questions that I would like to frame up. But before we get to my questions, I'm going to pass it to Carol to launch the poll, and then I'll be back on in a minute.
I'm assuming everybody's seeing this.
Yeah, it could shut up.
Great. All right. We'll give everybody about 30 more seconds, please. Okay, 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll now.
Okay,
And here are the results. Are y'all seeing the results?
Yep. Cool. Okay, I will just, if you'll go to the next slide, Carol, I'll finish up and then we'll transition into the discussion. So I don't want to dictate what we're going to talk about by any means. I know that you all probably have questions too, but if I could be selfish, I'd love to at least kind of frame these 3 questions for what I would love to hear about if we have time. Number 1, I'd love to ask the question whether we all think that UX engagement is warranted throughout this entire process. You know, I'm willing to accept that maybe I'm wrong and maybe we only really belong at the beginning and the end and I'm barking up the wrong tree. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Number 2, for that phase conceptual design where you're transitioning sort of research into requirements and a concept vision, what have you all found is the best way to translate that to your more technical team members? What are you using? What's working, not working? And finally, would love to hear about anybody else who has had success in selling UX involvement in some of those less obvious phases. If there's any tips and tricks, and sometimes even examples of failures where we weren't involved and then they've run into a wall, those can be turned into teachable moments. So would love to hear about those too. Okay, I'm passing it off.
We actually have some questions for you. Would you like to take those now?
Yes, sorry, Martha, I would love to.
Okay. So the first one, as stated earlier, was how do you know you've accounted for enough use cases?
Yeah, how do you know when you're done? Are we ever done? You know, in any sort of problem that we're solving. I think the idea here is, I'm probably going to answer with a non-answer. In our particular case, I would probably have to ask a technical team member, really, like, we'd have to kind of gauge, like, what does complete look like in terms of a you know, a data platform. And then we'd have to gauge our progress as we fold in the use cases. But I think in our situation, it's less about being complete and it's more about tackling those problems in priority order. So as long as we're kind of moving towards a more kind of cohesive data set and doing it in a way where we're solving the most critical problems and the most value add problems first, I have a feeling that, you know, the problem will change before we ever get to the end. So I don't know that I have a really clear answer on that one.
It's okay. The next one is maybe more for Carol. I don't know who it's for. Will this deck be shared? Are we allowed to take screenshots? I think it's yes and yes. Okay, yeah. Back to, if you go back a few slides, Carol, how is the z-axis defined?
So this would have been, so let me preface by saying I just created these out of this is not based on anything to do with our use cases. I was just making up some graphs to try to kind of show concepts. But in this particular case, so the Z variable, so if you can imagine maybe the size of the circle, let's say that the size of the circle is correlated to the cost. And so the larger the circle, then there's more cost associated with that particular cross section between the X and Y.
Was it this particular graph, Ryan, or was it a different one? You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, this was the one.
Okay, great.
And thank you.
Yeah. Carol Riggi wanted to know, did your team have business analysts? And if yes, how did their role overlap with yours?
I said no, and then I was sort of like, yes. I think in every case that's tricky. Is trying to, and I find every project team and every project a little bit different of trying to find that line between UX and BA. We did have some business analysts who had come in as third parties. So what they ended up doing is, in our case, we worked with them. They were helping the data science with more of that data mapping, but we ended up working with them to do that. But I'd say that we did the bulk of that work ourselves, more so than the BAs in this particular case. Yes, that's a tricky one. That's
I'm kind of curious. This is something where I'd like to throw it out to the group too. Like, do you find your roles as HCD UX people often or never, or sometimes overlapping with business analysts? If anybody wants to chime in with that.
You can chime in vocally by unmuting yourself if you had something to add there.
If not, we can move to the next question for Kate.
I know I find overlap for what it's worth. The next question is from Lisa Bruce. Can you talk a little more about the data vignettes and how those were chosen, developed, process, and who was involved?
Yeah. So again, I will preface that these are definitely not what we ended up doing, but they're just sort of examples I made up. But we tried to do, again, we tried not to make it overkill. So we did enough that we felt like we could, enough sort of data shots to answer the user's questions related to the goals. We designed that out based on the research, and then we did some validation exercises within users once we had come up with some of those concepts. And then we worked with the technical team to communicate those. Martha, can you repeat the question? I feel like I missed some things in there.
I will repeat it, and I will let you know the data vignettes were a big hit in the questions. So we've got another follow-up.
Okay.
So can you talk a little more about the data vignettes and how those were chosen, developed, the process, and who was involved? And then another person wanted to know, were the data vignettes an example of data mapping? So I can repeat any of that.
I'm gonna try. Okay. So I think I got most of the first question. So we, again, we took a stab. We had a list of the data that we knew that we needed in order to answer the question based on a lot of research that we did conduct with the end users. We took a stab at coming up with some ideas for what kind of a data display might look like. And then we reviewed that with end users and iterated on that, and then worked with the development team to make sure that that was understood and feasible and et cetera. So it would definitely some iterations there. Gosh, I can't seem to hold everything in my head.
It's a lot.
The second question.
Were the data vignettes an example of data mapping?
In a way. So you'll see, I mean, we have kind of the data model that we created to kind of communicate that in a different way. The data mapping does imply the data mapping. So, you know, for example, from this first one, that I need the Y variable data to be linked to the X variable data to be linked to the Z variable, right? And I know that tangibly tied to a specific use case for a specific question that the user is going to need to answer. So the data vignette, I think, almost kind of tries to attack the same problem that the data model does, but it does it from a use case perspective, whereas the data model does it more from an overview perspective. That makes sense.
Sure.
And I really appreciate these questions because it's making me think through more clearly what we were trying to do.
We've got another one. I love the engagement lifecycle chart. I don't know if you can go to that one, Carol, as it does a great job of illustrating the perception of value. It would be great to see how this perception matches actual value. Was any time spent in an after project evaluation, and that's the end of the question, but I guess was any time spent in after project evaluation to determine this?
Not yet, but I think it's a great idea. There's quite a bit of evolution on our side at the moment. But I think that's a great idea, and I think maybe that's a good something to pursue. I like it.
For sure. Then you've got another question here. Well, there's a thank you to the speakers and organizers. Very informative and insightful. We're happy to do this, Faiz. Thank you for joining us. Morgan would like to know, did you have a product owner who could stand in for an end user of the data?
We did. We did have product owners, but in our particular project team, the product owners were so busy just trying to manage a lot of the, I would say, overhead, and I hate to say administrative, but sometimes it ended up being that way. But what we did have, so they didn't really get to act as proxy users, but what we did have is we had real end users, and then we had what we call the SMEs. And both were important. The SMEs were sort of like a kind of a cross between the user and understanding more of kind of the business objectives. So I would say our SMEs were sort of like the POs, SMEs, and end users, and all three kind of ended up serving those needs. But the way that we sliced that up was a little bit special in our case.
So there are no more questions, though everyone can certainly feel free to pose questions.
I'd love to hear if anybody's got thoughts on
yeah, on your questions. There is a question, who is the end user? And let's go back to your three questions. But who is the end user?
Yeah, so and I think this is a good question because I think this will be relevant for a lot of people. So certainly our end users were going to be the ones who are going to be consuming the data. So that was the engineers and our geoscientists. But there's another user that we have to remember, which are going to be in our case, for the business teams that we're going to connect into our data platform, the ones who are going to kind of basically connect up that pipeline. There are also a subset of our users that we have to look at as well, right? To make sure that how they connect in and use it is going to be manageable and usable. So.
Your first question, do we believe that UX engagement is warranted throughout the process? I think that in that third question in our poll, that 19% of the folks here did not think that UX was warranted throughout the process. Am I correct in that, in what I saw?
I don't think this question was in the poll.
Oh, okay.
Unless I misunderstood.
Okay. Well, we've got time for
It depends. I'd love to hear from It Depends.
Yeah, talk about that, Bo.
I didn't vote for that. I was in the other percentage. I just remembered that the 19% was it depends, not no.
Oh, okay. Sorry. It depends. So,
yeah, no one said no.
Okay.
It was 81% said
Okay.
yes as far as
Okay.
end to end, and 19% it depends.
Oh,
I would
sorry. So
think-
it was in the poll. Sorry about that.
I would think, though, that the it depends portion might be related to the level of engagement at that point. So like you had the graph, and I said yes, not it depends, but as I see a graph that had the check mark in it for the perception of value, it may be the case that in some quick projects or prototypes or something, it's so fast, it may not need it or something. So that may explain some of it.
Sure.
But it could also be a balance. Early on in the project, on the problem identification, you might need more resources to identify the problem space, but maybe you need less engagement during development, but it's still needed.
Right.
I wonder if that perception is because there's not enough for them to do, too big a team, it's not balanced right on when it gets the check mark starts going down. So that's why I said it'd be great if we'd set the actuals against that would just be awesome to see how that balances out.
Well, and I will say part of the picture that I didn't really add here is that we were working in Agile. So, when we're moving into support development, that I'm sure you're all aware, that's not the only thing that, we were doing. We were then working the next use cases. So I'd love to say that we're sitting around with our feet up, but with Agile, certainly we're kind of doing a lot of that support work at the same time that we're working on the early phases of the next cases. So.
This has been a lively discussion, and unfortunately, we're almost out of time, so we can't take any more questions. I'm going to throw it to Carol. Thank you very much, Kate.
Thank you, Martha. You're on mute.
From all of us, thank you. Yeah, I didn't want to slap in people's ears. What's next? Well, first of all, I do want to say thank you to all of you for your interest and great questions and attention. This is a topic that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts, but it's just such unknown territory that the more we can share and learn from each other, the better. So what's next? Please stay tuned for a paper on this topic. It's been submitted for publication, so keep an eye out for that. Probably in the Journal of Usability Studies, we'll see exactly where it winds up being published. Look for us. When I say us, it's the royal us in person. At UXPA, hopefully that'll fly in September. If not, we'll be elsewhere. And we want to keep this conversation going with everyone who's interested, all of you. If you have any colleagues you'd like to bring into this conversation, we have a Slack channel. We're going to reach out to everyone after this meetup today with some information about how to access that Slack channel, how to access the recording and deck from today. And then we're going to have an in-person and virtual combined event, hopefully in person, in October 2020. That'll be the next big thing. So until then, y'all, thank you so much. Please, everyone, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Carol. Great job.
Thanks, everybody.
Good job.
Take care, everyone.